Thousands of students at more than 130 colleges and universities across the US are protesting against the ongoing war in Gaza. Student activism has been a catalyst for change throughout history. They have played a significant role in challenging oppressive regimes, advocating for civil rights, and demanding political reforms. Let's see a few such events where students changed the fate of their country and subsequently the world. The White Rose was a peaceful resistance group in Nazi Germany, founded by medical students in 1942. The group joined with other students and anonymously began publishing leaflets opposing the Nazi regime. By 1943, the White Rose was painting graffiti on buildings around Munich with phrases like "Down with Hitler." The group was caught distributing leaflets and arrested. They went through a sham trial and were beheaded. Today, in Germany and abroad, the White Rose resistance is highly respected and inspiring to young activists. The 1960s was a period of significant social, cultural and political change in the US. There were civil rights movement, women liberation movement, anti-war movement and so on. Universities and colleges witnessed large-scale protests against the war, with students occupying campus buildings, holding rallies and boycotting classes to voice their dissent. Some of the most notable protests were witnessed at institutions like Berkeley, Columbia and Kent State University. In 1970, tensions peaked at Kent State University when authorities tried to halt a scheduled protest, which led to tragic consequences. The National Guard opened fire to control the crowd, and 4 students were killed and 9 were wounded. This incident sparked an anti-war sentiment nationwide, leading to a massive student strike involving nearly 4 million participants. South Africa had the Apartheid system. It was a system of institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination that was implemented from 1948 to early 1990s. Interracial marriage was not allowed. Blacks were forced to reside in places where their labor would benefit white settlers. Their movement was restricted and they had to carry identification documents with them all the time. Unequal education was a major part of apartheid. In 1953, a law put black South African education under the national government. Schools were poorly maintained, and as per reports, in 1961, only 10% of teachers teaching in black schools were high school graduates. Then, the Soweto Uprising began. Thousands of students protested on the streets of the Soweto township against unfair education in June 1976. The police attacked, hundreds were killed and over 1,000 were injured. Students continued to organize anti-apartheid protests across the country, drawing international attention and condemnation of the apartheid regime. The system was finally repealed in the early 1990s. You must have seen this photo in your digital journey. A man holding what looks like bags of groceries or other household essentials confronting a fleet of tanks. This incident was a part of the Tiananmen Square incident in China. There were a series of protests across China in 1989. Those were commonly known as the Tiananmen Square protests, and protesters called for political reforms, increased freedom of speech and greater democracy. The protests began in April 1989 but gained momentum and reached a peak in early June when thousands of students, workers and intellectuals gathered at Tiananmen Square in Beijing. The protesters erected a large statue called the Goddess of Democracy and engaged in hunger strikes and peaceful demonstrations to demand political change. On June 3, 1989, the Chinese government declared martial law and launched a military crackdown on the protesters. The People's Liberation Army arrived with tanks and tear gas. It is unknown how many were killed or wounded, but thousands were arrested and some executed. It was during this military operation that the tank man confronted a column of tanks. Foreign journalists recorded this event in photos and videos. The man has never been identified, but his image lives on as a symbol of resistance, and the photo quickly became legendary but was censored within China. Over half a century ago, in the 1960s, civil unrest rocked most parts of the world, but France, in particular, experienced a flashpoint that brought the country's economy to a halt and even led President Charles de Gaulle to briefly flee the country, and it all started with students. People were not feeling very warm toward the government, and a mix of social, political and economic tensions in 1968 saw mass demonstrations with about 6,000 student participants on the streets of Paris. Within days, it had developed into a civil dispute that saw 10 million French workers go on a general strike, bringing the economy to a virtual halt. Universities across the country shut down as students, often joined by their professors, occupied the classrooms and courtyards. In Paris and other major French cities, workers, students, intellectuals and others flooded the streets for rallies. In the history of France, it was a remarkable movement. Both the women's liberation movement and the gay rights movement in France grew out of the 1968 upheaval and the intellectual ferment of the time. In May 1998, student protests in Indonesia led to the resignation of President Suharto, who had ruled for over 30 years. This marked the start of the Reformasi era, bringing freedom of speech, freedom of expression and democratic elections. The protests started because the government wanted to reduce the authority of the anti-corruption agency and introduce a new criminal code. The code aimed to ban premarital sex and punish insults against the president. Critics believed these changes would undo important reforms and also draw attention to other issues like workers' rights, environmental concerns, and women's rights. Mass protests prevented the bill from passing and also made President Suharto resign.